And as Dorian lashes the Carolina coast, to the political intersection of this story we go. President Trump is now on day 5 of insisting Hurricane Dorian was on a path to hit Alabama. Late this afternoon, Rear Admiral Peter Brown, who is Trump's counterterrorism and homeland security advisor, think about that for a moment, who said he briefed the president multiple times on Sunday about Dorian's arrival, issued a statement appearing to take the blame for Trump's warnings, certainly giving the president much-needed air cover. And we quote, "I showed the president the official National Hurricane Center forecast, which included the cone that projects the potential path of the eye of the storm. The president's comments were based on that morning's Hurricane Dorian briefing, which included the possibility of tropical storm force winds in southeastern Alabama. In fact, from the evening of Tuesday, August 27th until the morning of Monday, September 2nd, the forecast from the National Hurricane Center showed the possibility of tropical storm winds hitting parts of Alabama." Trump defended himself 5 times on Twitter just today, insisting he was right all along about Alabama, which thankfully has been spared tonight thanks to the president's quick action. Here for our lead-off discussion on a Thursday evening, 3 top reporters covering this White House: Ashley Parker of The Washington Post, Jonathan Lemire of The Associated Press, and Nancy Cook of Politico. Good evening and welcome to you both. Ashley, what is left to say about this except what your newspaper has added to the reporting tonight? This is in the Washington Post, and they say flatly, this is, by the way, the work of Tolu Olorunipa and Josh Dawsey, 2 of your colleagues. It was Trump who used a black Sharpie to mark up an official NOAA map, which he displayed during an Oval Office briefing on Wednesday. According to a White House official who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations. No one else writes like that on a map with a black Sharpie, the official said of the map, which added Alabama into the hurricane's potential pathway inside the loop of the marker. Ashley, we said this last night. This is minor in the scope of the U.S. presidency. This isn't family separation. It is far short of a declaration of war. But this is another one of those firsts. And as they said in the 60s, holds true today. The whole world is watching.
That's true. When we first saw that doctored map, there was a lot of suspicion that it was the president who had doctored it. The Sharpie in that sort of big scrawl is his trademark. That's what we reported this evening. And to sort of give you a sense of the mood inside the West Wing and how officials are handling this, on the one hand, when that map was shown, they had taken it and they had put it sort of behind where the president was. This wasn't something they wanted him to broadcast to the world. And it was top of mind. He asked for it to be brought back up and showed it. But again, I was over at the White House today, and look, White House aides would tell you privately they wish the president would stop tweeting about Alabama. It's not particularly helpful. But this is also, at this point, somewhat routine. There was not panic or mayhem or scrambling. It was basically business as usual against the backdrop of the president making what initially seemed to be a sort of well-intentioned but honest mistake, and then doubling, tripling, quadrupling, octupling down on it.
Jonathan Lemire, what do White House aides make of the president's choice to keep this issue alive and bubbling on, and perhaps what it means we're not talking about and covering?
That's right. To follow up on Ashley's point, I mean, this story, it was born of an innocent mistake the president tweeted over the weekend, and it was corrected by the National Weather Service, which remains a pretty extraordinary thing. But it could have died just then and there. It was Labor Day weekend. It didn't have that much media attention. The story would have been over. We're not.
Speaking of first, you just mentioned this. I have to interject. We had never seen the National Weather Service feel the need to correct a sitting president in the history of our republic.
Another norm shattered by this administration. But instead, we're now on day 5. And yes, he isn't just doubled or tripled or octupled. I think it's 9 times now, non-upted, I don't know, whatever it might be. He is still keeping this alive. And there is some frustration, as Ashley said, of people around him. There's plenty of people just rolling their eyes, too. But I think we don't want to lose sight of something here. Yes, on one hand, this is sort of a silly story, and it's a president who can never admit a mistake, who has said it, written in his books, and has preached this and practiced what he preaches in terms of never saying he was sorry, never saying I was wrong. But this is the president's words matter. Any president's words matter, whether it's in a tweet or in a declaration from the Oval Office. They move markets. They can rattle global capitals. And in this case, potentially frighten people who live in a state that actually wasn't in any danger from this hurricane. And we have seen time and time again that after he says something, he then sort of relies on government resources. He calls upon the power of the White House to try to then almost reverse engineer what he said into reality, to try to cover for him. We saw it with when he claimed that there are millions of illegal voters in 2016. He rigged an election commission to look into it. It didn't find any evidence of that. You know, when he declared that he had the largest attendance at any inauguration, he made Sean Spicer go out there and lie from the White House podium to say that. He made Sean Spicer do that again when he tried to explain that mysterious late-night tweet Covfefe, when Spicer said, oh, the president and people around him knew what he was talking about. And we see it today from his counterterrorism czar to have to put pen to paper and release a memo sort of taking the blame and giving the president cover for what was simply a mistake.
Nancy Cook, somewhere there's an elderly couple tonight, scared out of their wits, without power, on a windy, rainy night on the coast of North Carolina, perhaps in a single wide that is rocking back and forth. No words from the president about the victims of this storm, the grievous rising death toll in our neighbors 50 miles to our east in the Bahamas. Also, somewhere tonight, there's a Trump campaign official trying to chart a course, realizing that it's the daily grievance that we are covering. It's the daily grievance that sooner or later becomes what passes for the direction of a presidency.
Well, I think that came up several times in conversations I was having today with people about this story, just that the president, as you said, did not acknowledge the people who had died in the Bahamas, did not acknowledge the devastation there. Some of the senior administration officials that I spoke to today did talk about that, but that wasn't top of mind to the president. He was really tweeting and retweeting and doubling down on this whole Alabama controversy. And I talked to the president of the Union of the National Weather Service organization, who represents hurricane forecasters. And this person was making the point to me, it's very dangerous when the president is sending out mixed messages on the path of a hurricane. It's just very confusing. The president needs to support the National Weather Service and their fact-based evidence that showed very clearly throughout the day that the hurricane was moving towards the Carolinas, South Carolina and North Carolina, and was nowhere near Alabama. And by continuing to draw attention to Alabama, the president was in a way both undermining the National Weather Service, but also just confusing people who may not be glued to Twitter or the TV all day and may be a supporter of the president and may now be confused about what is actually happening and whether they need to evacuate.
Yeah, just to underscore that as a weather matter, as we look at this storm, if you are in the path of this tonight, the tornadoes it is kind of spinning off are traveling across land at between 40 and 50 miles an hour, roughly the speed a car drives. If you're in the path of one of those, you've got to hope that the National Weather Service is there and on your side and warning you as far in advance as humanly possible.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.